that's very common. A lot of times Jesus would get that reaction out of people. Like, we don't understand him. Even his own disciples, said things like, who is this? But with these teachers of the law, I think they're kind of at this point where we don't know what to say. Got to say something, at least into ourselves. They're speaking to themselves quietly. And so they say, he's blaspheming. Well, that's like one of the worst things you can do, right? And have you ever noticed that? Sometimes people find themselves in situations and they're not sure what to say, so they say the thing that's the most dramatic. We do this with our language. We say the dramatic. And in that moment, Jesus knew what they were thinking in his spirit. Do you remember the story of Jesus was on his way? He'd been summoned to heal. And on the way, a woman reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. She's the woman that had an issue of blood. And the whole story stops. It's like, Jesus, we need you to come heal. Someone reaches out. Jesus says, who touched me? And then goes through this whole thing. She is healed. The whole story stops. And then he goes and he does the healing. This is the same thing. I mean, it's not as dramatic and you don't notice it. But in a way, what Jesus is doing here is responding to them. And he's saying, you think what this is all about is a paralyzed guy on a mat. What I'm here to tell you, religious leaders, is that your hearts are paralyzed. And you're really the ones on a spiritual mat. How often, I think, we find ourselves missing the point. He uses this, which is easier to say. It's the same as he said, how easy is it for the camel to go through the eye of a needle? And then he goes back to the original and he says, take up your mat. And he took up his mat. And of course, everybody who is gathered was astounded by this. As I was thinking, as Darlene and I were thinking about this passage, we kind of thought about this, that, in one way, looked at it in one way, you could see the Middle East, North Africa, as being paralyzed and on a mat and in need of healing. It's 25, at least how we define it. It's 25 countries. It's over 500 million people. Less than 2% Christian. And it would be way less than that, except in Egypt, it's about 10% Christian because of the Coptic church that's there. The actual number of, what we would say active followers of Jesus, who knows? It's a place where persecution takes a lot of forms. We hear about the dramatic. We hear about people being killed, or churches being torn down, or people being jailed. But there's also forms of persecution. As we talk to sisters and brothers that live in the region, we find out that sometimes the persecution is just, well, if you're a Christian, there's a lot of jobs you can't get. Or if you're a Christian, you're just kind of, you're shunned a bit. One of the difficult forms of persecution that we've heard as we've been there is one that comes up when they say, because these are Arab Christians, right? They say things like this: why do our brothers and sisters in the West hate us? Now, how do they form that opinion? They form that opinion because of what they see in the news media about what this part of the world says about that part of the world. And they've kind of translated that over to think they must hate us. It's a place that sometimes feel like it's on a map because there are small, struggling fellowships of people. They're honest about it. These are honest believers. There's conflict between the historic churches, the evangelical churches, Western missionary. There is conflict there. And so, on one way, it looks like this is an illustration of people on the mat in need of healing. But then I read the parallel text in Matthew chapter 9. It starts this way. Jesus stepped into a boat and crossed over and came to his hometown, so he's returning. Some men brought to him a paralyzed man lying on a mat, and when Jesus saw their faith, he said to them, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." This is not a second sort of similar. This is the exact same text. It fits in the context. I know it's chapter 2 and 9, but Matthew takes a lot longer to talk about things than Mark does. The wording's the same. It's about the paralyzed man, but do you notice what's missing is they don't have the unroofing the roof. It's not in this. And why is that? I wonder, at least for maybe not in the day, but for me today, it started me thinking. Now, our role is to plant a mission region. And we can get very energized about our strategic plan. And we can think, maybe like those guys. Okay, here's the obstacles. There's a big crowd, no problem. There's a stairway on the side. Go up the stairway. Oh, there's a problem. There's a roof. No problem. We'll just unroof the roof. We got rope. We got a mat. We can do this. And I think what we sometimes can miss, I love this passage. It says, "Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh," this is the Apostle Paul saying to the church, "what is lacking in regard to Christ's affliction for the sake of his body, which is the church." Is that sometimes we miss the fact that maybe we're the ones on the mat. And our brothers and sisters in the Middle East and North Africa are the ones that have something that we need to hear. Darlene's going to come and she's just going to introduce you to some people we've had the privilege of meeting. And as we do that, start thinking about what does it mean, who is really on the mat?
These guys aren't from Middle East, North Africa, but I'm going to talk about them first. But as Jeff said, it's really easy to look at the MENA region with all its conflict, turmoil, uncertainty, and all the needs in this region that's full of people who are symbolically on a mat, needing our help to see and encounter the healing touch of Jesus, and they do need that. And we as a MENA team are seeking to carry by prayer and practical action those who are hurting and in need in this region to Jesus, where we hope that they'll find the love of Christ and be transformed by that love. So as Jeff and I have been about this work for 2 years now, we've been surprised over and over to notice that in the midst of our helping, we often find ourselves being on that mat, being carried to Jesus by the same people that we thought we were helping. We end up being the ones that are carried. So here's an illustration a little closer to home of how we've been seeing this happen. These are friends of ours from Canada, so not from the Middle East, North Africa, but from Canada, not too far away. This is the Franklin family. Patrick there in the hat, the dad, he's about 43 years old. This is a picture that was taken about a year ago. But since the beginning of August, we've been sharing in a journey with these friends of ours from Canada. In very real ways, we from a distance have been carrying Patrick on a mat for healing to Jesus. He was at a baseball game and started feeling sick in the beginning of August and had a massive heart attack. They got him to emergency, and right before they got him in the door, he had a cardiac arrest. And really, by all medical signs, he shouldn't have lived, but he did. Only to be followed by complication after complication. He got a really bad infection, his kidney shut down, he needed to be on dialysis. His care team says that Patrick is a miracle, that he's still alive. But as we've been reaching out, responding to their needs, and trying to offer our presence and encouragement, even from a ways away, there's been this unexpected sense that in their pain and suffering, they are somehow carrying us. Like when Patrick for weeks was teetering on a fence between life and death, and hope for life seemed almost too much to dream for or hope for. We would hear from Elena, his wife, and she would, in the midst of her darkness, say that these words of a song kept running over and over in her mind. Strength for today, bright hope for tomorrow. You probably sing that song yourselves. Reminders to me that no matter how hopeless a situation seems, God has what we need. And in fact, no matter what, there is hope. In this reminder, I, the supposed giver, was receiving and being carried closer to Jesus. As Patrick is beginning to recover, oh so slowly, learning to breathe, to speak, to swallow, to walk all over again, I started to receive unexpectedly again through their suffering. Elena writes, receiving help, receiving the giving is the other side of sacrificial giving. It's sacrificial receiving. Not always easy to do, because we have to recognize our need. Together, sacrificial giving and sacrificial receiving is a fragrant offering, an act of worship completed. She was talking about her receiving, but in this mystery of partnership and community, the giver often becomes the receiver. The mat bearer receiving as they find themselves being carried to Jesus. This has been so true for me in our work with Mina and the amazing people that we have met there. This journey hasn't been easy for us. We lived in Canada. Jeff was the conference superintendent of the Canada Covenant. I was a nurse, raising my 5 kids, just living life, being involved in our communities, and then God surprised us and called us to this. So we're pouring our energies out, our gifts, and our hearts into this work. I always love it when my aunt says, isn't this a time of life that you're supposed to start settling down a little bit? But God has other ideas. So sometimes it's overwhelming, yet in the giving, I'm unexpectedly surprised by the reversal of roles. Those we serve begin to carry me with all my brokenness to Jesus. We met Stephen. He's the guy on the right in the back there. He's in his late 20s. He's displaced from his home in Yemen due to conflict. So he's a refugee, and he's living in Egypt. He was raised in a Muslim home and a Muslim culture. He tells me that he barely escaped death at least 5 times before he left Yemen. One of those times, a bomb landed close to him and his friend. He lived, and his friend died. He talks to me about his memory of carrying his dead friend away from the wreckage. After leaving Yemen, he learned of Jesus, and over time, he became a follower of Christ. He tells me of his frustration with God, though, and pouring out questions like, God, why all this war? Why all this suffering? And then he tells me, I heard God say, what do you think, that I don't know? This is my job. This is what he hears God say to him. And Stephen, in some ways, now has become my mat bearer, showing me how to trust and see God in ways that I hadn't seen him before, realizing that he's not left us alone in our questions and suffering and overwhelming tasks, but in fact, God knows this is his job. He can and does bring so much good from our pain, our questions, and our struggles. Do you find that? Sometimes the hardest things we face, God shows up in the biggest ways. In fact, Stephen says that in spite of the awfulness of his home country and what they're going through in war and conflict, that people are finding Jesus through this war. We have seen so much pain and struggle in the Middle East, North Africa region, but we too have seen God at work in the midst of it. One of our focuses with MENA is ministries to refugees. In many ways, their needs and situations require the help of others. In small ways, we're trying to follow God in reaching out to these communities, and we carry their mats. We are learning that together in giving, we are also mutually receiving. So our first trip, I hadn't been to a refugee settlement till about 2 years ago. It was a new experience for me. I didn't even really know what to expect. And I was overwhelmed. I told my family, I said, I'm just going to cry myself across Middle East, North Africa, because there's so much pain and suffering in that region. So I was overwhelmed by what I saw and what I began to learn. And in the midst of so much need, here are some of the images from my first trip to a refugee settlement. Children laughing and playing in the dirt paths between their tent homes in the middle of the school day. They weren't at school. Women gathering together in sparsely furnished tents, hugging one another, giggling together, passing babies among themselves. We can see that in our own churches. They were gathering to learn about community health, what to do about dehydration, how to manage lice in these crowded communities they live in. Men were offering us seating on plastic chairs, a treasured commodity. They gave us the chairs while most everyone else stood or sat on the ground. A young mom with sparkling eyes and a wide smile, she stretched out her arms, embracing her 3 children as I take their picture. She's bravely communicating hope, despite the fact that she just had told me that she fled alone from Syria with her children because her husband was killed in the conflict. A young, quiet teenage girl dressed in red, I asked her what her biggest hope and dream was. She tells me that she hopes that someday she could learn to read, something we take for granted. A man in his 90s. He was standing tall and straight with dignity. He had a broad smile, and he had a good sense of humor. His wife, younger, sitting on the ground on a dirt path. She was diabetic, and she had a knee wound that was not healing because she had trouble walking, and she had to crawl on her hands and knees to get around in her tent home on the uneven dirt floor. So as I am there to give, to carry their mat, I receive. I learn of hope, resilience, hospitality, community, and also of pain and heartache. A year later, I return. The older couple was welcome and eager to welcome us. The man, he's still standing tall, but he had a little more of a droop in his shoulders. Still had a smile, but his memory was fading. His wife was sitting on the ground in their living room in their tent, furnished only with a rug. They lost all their stuff because there had been flooding in that refugee camp, in many of those refugee settlements this last year. Their hope seems to have faded a little bit in this year's time since we saw them last. Yet as I sat on the floor holding the woman's hand in the hospitality of this home, unfurnished, wafting a wet, musty smell mingled with a strong scent of urine, I prayed that our love for them was felt and brought encouragement, at least for this moment. I received the gift of understanding that in this space where they had little to offer us, and we had really little to offer them, yet giving of ourselves to one another was enough. And in any given moment, how we share of ourselves, it matters. They didn't know it, but they were carrying my mat to Jesus. I don't think they even know Jesus yet, but they were in some way carrying me to Jesus. Aisha, the girl in red, we saw her again. She remembered us. She was still shy. She seemed a little less energetic and a little less hopeful this time. She remembered that she told me that her dream was to learn to read. She told me that she hasn't learned to read yet, and I don't even know if she still hopes for it. But in some way, I carry this dream for Aisha. We met her grandmother. Grandma is the only family each of the two have with each other. She thanked us for the visit. They're a Muslim family, and she asked Allah to bless us as I asked my God to care for them and bless them. I learned that we love one another by our prayers. That prayer is powerful, both in loving and caring for one another. So in this mystery of caring for each other, in bringing the broken and hurting to Jesus, we are changed. Caring for one another is hard work. It comes at a cost. It takes effort and discipline to look outside of ourselves. It's a lot easier and more comfortable to look inside. But don't miss the gift that Jesus calls us to, all of us, to take opportunities to care for one another. Be attentive to the people and the needs that God brings your way. Maybe your neighbor, maybe a coworker, maybe a family member, maybe people living in Mena or anywhere else, in Montana, maybe around the world, who knows? But this I know, when we give, we unexpectedly become the receiver. Together we both carry and are carried to Jesus. We give and we receive. Together, this giving and receiving, a fragrant offering, an act of worship.
So if we think about this passage, we realize that really there were a number of people who were brought to Jesus. There was certainly this man. There were his friends. There was the crowd. There was the religious leaders. And we always have the opportunity in a time like this to say, well, I think I know what this is about. As you think about your relationships, like Darlene was just saying, is there any chance that maybe a relationship that you think is one where you're carrying that person, that maybe that person might be used by God to carry you? We are obviously not typical people starting out with Serve Globally. Most people starting with Serve Globally start a whole lot younger. If you saw briefly the slide with our team of people, we have a great team. Nancy Jo Hoover, who has done community development literally around the world. She is close to, she calls it being repurposed. And then Andy Larson is on our team. He focuses, one of our focus, Muslim engagement. That's really his area of specialty. And then Darlene and I were the original team of 4, and so my nickname was Team Geriatric. But then the Bakers came on, and they're in their 30s, so our average age now has been dropped down, and we're not. But, you know, if you listen, God will speak to you. I was in Bethlehem, and there was a small group of Canadian leaders that had been invited by World Vision to go and see what could we do, okay? Whose mat could we carry? That was the purpose. And for about 6 straight days, we did 6 to 10 meetings a day, meeting with people. And we were in Nazareth meeting with a group of people. And if you've ever traveled internationally, there's a bit of a thing that happens at the end of everything is you kind of go around the circle. And if you're visiting, you say why it was so great to be visiting. And if you're from the place, you say why it was so great that the visitors came. And we were going around, and I noticed, there was about 12 people, and I noticed one guy, he didn't look angry, but he just looked like he was in pain. And we came to him, and he said something that I'd never heard said in a setting like that. He said, "I'm sorry, I can't say I'm glad you're here." Now he says, it's nothing about you personally, but he said, I have been to so many of these meetings. I've had so many people come who say that they want to partner, who say that they want this partnership in the gospel that we heard about earlier, and they come and they say nice words and we never see them again. And so I feel even more isolated from my brothers and sisters in the West when this happens. And I didn't know if I could take it, but I thought, I'm going to come one more time. And at that moment, I realized I thought I was there to learn how to carry these people on a mat to Jesus. And in that moment, in listening to him, I realized, no. He just helped me see how I'm on the mat. That my whole attitude needs to change. My excuses that, well, we're part of a small group, what can we do? Those need to change. And so, thanks to the words of my now friend Johanna, I came up with a very small decision. Well, I can go back and I can bring people, other Christians, other believers, to come and to hear stories and to see how we can partner together. And it's really just that simple. What might God be calling you to do right here in Dassel, in this community, in the network of people you have, or maybe in the Middle East and North Africa? Let's pray. God, we are grateful for this group that risked really so many things to bring this friend to you. And for those people who we can think of who have brought us to you at times, we give you thanks. For the privilege of having the opportunity to bring people to Jesus, we give you thanks. And I pray today that in some way this text that is over 2,000 years old would come alive and find roots and meaning in the lives of those that are here. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Would you please stand with us? It's the song of the redeemed, rising from the African plain. It's the song of the forgiven, drowning out the Amazon rain. The song of Asian believers, filled with God's holy fire. It's every tribe, every tongue, every nation, a love song born of a grateful choir. It's all God's children singing glory, glory, hallelujah, He reigns, He reigns. It's all God's children singing glory, glory, hallelujah, He reigns, He reigns. Let it rise above the four winds, caught up in the heavenly sound. Let praises echo from the towers of cathedrals to the faithful gathered on the ground. Of all the songs sung from the dawn of creation, some were meant to persist. Of all the bells rung from 1,000 steeples, none rings truer than this. It's all God's children singing glory, glory, hallelujah, He reigns. He